listening to the Ferment Podcast, conversations about worship and spiritual transformation. Today's guest is well-known songwriter, worship leader, and pastor, David Ruis.
All right, we are here today with one of my good friends, David Ruis. Good to have you around, David.
Thank you, sir. It's really great to be here.
Yeah, really happy that you're not just on the podcast today, but you're actually in my hometown here in Campbellsville, Kentucky.
This is very cool.
This is super cool.
Yeah.
Well, for those of you who don't know, this is the Ferment Podcast, and sort of the idea behind this conversational space is that this would be a place where we have conversations about worship and spiritual transformation.
Mm.
And for that reason, this is going to be a really good little moment here with you. What I want to do, David, before we get into maybe some of the things that you and I were chatting
Sure.
off mic earlier, I would love it if you would just fill people in a little bit on your journey, because now you're like director of Vineyard Canada, national director.
That's what they tell me. We'll see.
So you're one of the guys right now in our movement. But what happened earlier? Like, where did your spiritual journey begin, and what were some of these early days like? Maybe even pre-Vineyard.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, try to give the snapshot. I know it's sort of the classic joke. Well, I was born, but it's sort of for me that actually is a pretty significant part of the story because I was adopted. So I was adopted into a home where my parents had actually just come into an awareness of Christ. So they were baptized in this little tiny Baptist church way up in the north of Alberta in Canada, in Wolf Creek, like literally, like you think Campbellsville is small, like that is like,
yeah.
And started their married life. Their actual first home was a portion of the barn of one of my uncles, and came to a deep faith, found Jesus kind of up in the middle of this wilderness. So a little while after that, they migrated back down to the southern Alberta. I'm adopted into this atmosphere. So it's kind of interesting how they were wonderful in the way of creating an awareness of being adopted and yet it not being a big deal. I always kind of knew it. So I think that really set me well in acceptance, understanding the Father, actually, and like a whole bunch of things. So,
and how old were you when you were adopted?
I was just an infant. I was just a few months old, and there's just layers of kind of cool stuff to all of that. I've just found actually birth family in the last few years.
Amazing.
And that's a whole other adventure, which I'd love to unpack at some time. But yeah, pretty cool stuff. So I know as bizarre as it is to go that far back, it actually is a pretty significant piece of the journey. And so they were very much part of this denominational community. But it was fairly entrenched. The beauty of acceptance, actually a true cultivation of community and stuff. A lot of what I know about community today, actually, I learned from that environment in that Baptist sort of space. But it was deeply entrenched in cessationism and a sort of a very fundamental kind of a posture. So I wasn't sure what to do. I launched into, I had a few options in front of me, but the other sort of intriguing thing, parallel with sort of kind of a fundamental background, was a classical background musically. So I never played in a garage band. I didn't do all that stuff. I was actually on my way to become part of the Southern Alberta Opera Company or choose to go towards vocational ministry. It was one of those decisions.
And if you were choosing between the opera company, what did you play? Piano?
I was piano. I was trained piano and then vocal training as well. I was a charter member of the Calgary Boys Choir, which became a pretty significant touring choir internationally. And also, a little bizarre thing, made the cut for the Vienna Boys Choir. My parents at the last minute didn't feel I should go to Europe, which was actually a great choice. It's kind of one of these weird stories again where while we were living in Los Angeles, so this, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago, there was this huge article in the LA Times, the current sort of continuing culture of the exposure of a lot of sexual abuse and all that stuff. But there was this really dark window in the history of the Vienna Boys Choir where there was a lot of abuse going on. And I kind of looked at the day. It would have been the exact time that I would have actually been over there.
And your parents sort of just said,
held back. My mom had this really crazy intuitive gut thing, which now she fully realizes is the Holy Spirit and has cultivated that in a wonderful way. My parents kind of really came along with us on this journey.
Okay, so they began as cessationists as well, but then something changed for them.
Yeah, we planted a church in the mid-'80s, Baptist church, and went to Anaheim in '87 and just got blown up.
How did you even find out about Anaheim? Or the vineyard? For those who don't know, that's like the beginnings of the vineyard.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, towards the beginnings for sure. Yeah, there was a fella in the Vancouver area, a guy named George Malone, who had encounters with John Wimber and brought him up into the Canadian context the first time. I think it was like, I don't know, wherever it was, 84, 85, something like that. And a few of my friends were really impacted there. And I had no grid for any of this stuff. There was also a prof in my school who had been part of Wimber's very first MC 510 class in Fuller. And so he was kind of a closet charismatic, kind of thing. And he was kind of feeding this stuff on the side in my senior year. I'd come to my sister had flown way off the rails as far as spirituality. And I was praying and praying, didn't know what to do. She stumbled into a little church in our city. Long story short, there was a message in tongues that was then interpreted, which like described her whole story to a T. She couldn't resist herself, had run down to the front of this little church and completely turned her life around, and contacted me just as I was getting in the car to go to college. So I kind of carried into this cessationist environment and to be trained sort of in this ethos with this story of my sister, just kind of like...
Yeah, radical salvation.
Absolutely. Like just dangling in the back of my head. And every time I would bring this up in theological discussion and stuff, I was so dissatisfied with the answers. So by the end of our tenure in school, came out with a bachelor in religious education with an emphasis in theology, then went to church plant, 21 years old, which was kind of crazy. But I'd come to a conclusion of a non-cessationist position with no experience, like just purely just wrestling with the biblical text.
And this one story from your sister.
And this thing of my sister, like I couldn't shake this thing. And with no satisfactory answers, well, God can do anything, and that's just like a one-off or just an anomaly, but it's all blah, blah, blah. And so a few friends had heard of Wimber. One of my elders in our community just bought plane ticket, everything, said, just go on down there. So flew down to Anaheim and was completely, and all of a sudden, all the pennies started dropping, all the pieces started coming into place.
Yeah, you had the experience at that point. Everything that was just intellectual.
That became the experience. Yeah. So it's kind of funny. It was like sort of a backwards kind of adventure. It was sort of, very interesting.
You had the beginnings of a theology before you had the experience.
It's really true. It's really interesting. Yeah.
Amazing. And what was it about Anaheim or the vineyard in those early days, to use your words, that was causing the pennies to drop?
I think it was the sort of double whammy, two-sided coin. The one side of the incredible, tangible, like unmistakable encounter with God, particularly in worship.
Yeah.
But when I say worship, I mean the whole, in the midst of the just crying out to God. Songs, of course, very important in that. But for me, it was so formative because what at least I saw modeled, and I think has shaped me to this day, was the whole worship experience was transformative. So it was internal, but it was also just as much then in the midst of that encounter, turning and extending your hand in the name of this Jesus that you're worshiping and praying for someone's healing. Or seeing them with eyes in a brand new way, or seeing prophetically certain things. To me, it was this whole thing. So that was like just huge.
Yeah, what I think I hear you say is worship wasn't just something that happened to you; it was something that came through you. Like or that experience, whatever
Sure.
that was. It
Yeah.
wasn't just something that happened to me,
Yeah.
but it was like through us.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
And then the other side of that coin would be the articulation of kingdom theology.
Was that the first time you'd heard it
Yeah.
like that?
Yeah, for sure.
Was that ever a part of your experience in school?
No.
Yeah.
No, it was
Okay.
completely brand
Just
new.
the message of the kingdom.
The message of the kingdom, and it's really fascinating because I've been talking to some friends about this recently. There was a huge part of it for me, which I think began to shape me even then, and I think is so necessary in the current conversation around kingdom theology, was Wimber was really hitting the centrality of the sermon and the Beatitudes at the heart of the understanding of the kingdom.
Wow.
And that was revolutionary for me because I'd been in the setting, there's all sorts of approaches to that aspect of Jesus' teaching, but as cessationists particularly, you basically have just kind of written that out of the script. It was sort of this unattainable, idealistic,
Well, isn't
something.
that nice?
Yeah, exactly.
Isn't that sweet?
Exactly. It wasn't sort of this thing that you were actually called to live out. And for me, a lot of the trajectory of that, drilling deeper and deeper into that understanding of the kingdom, I think got knocked off its trajectory with some of our history. And I don't think it's history that should be changed or that wasn't necessary. The prophetic era,
Yeah.
Toronto blessing, all these things. But it pulled an understanding of the kingdom present out of a beatitudinal, if that's even a word.
That's a
Let's
great
just
word.
make it up
I
right
love
now.
it. Love it.
Out of a beatitudinal space into more this power space.
Yes.
And I think that was necessary. That was part of the recalibration.
Yeah,
of the spirit.
recapturing something.
Absolutely. That was the sort of central aspect of Jesus getting his church back then.
Mm-hmm.
But I think now Jesus getting his church back, at least for those of us that would have a kingdom framework, is the core of the Beatitudes.
And for those of us who are listening to this and you've never heard,
you're going, what on earth is this guy
you've
talking
never
about?
heard of Jesus getting his church back. That was something that John would say, right?
Yes,
Like he would
exactly.
say, Jesus wants his church back. And
Yeah.
so earlier, maybe it became in power expressions.
Yeah.
But even then, there was this Sermon on the Mount thing.
I think so. Like
Yeah.
for me, that
Yeah.
was very instrumental.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Huh.
Very instrumental. And then
So the Vineyard has Dallas Willard roots.
oh my word.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are you kidding? Absolutely.
Yeah, because that's what I hear when you say Beatitudes and stuff. I instantly think of Dallas.
Yeah.
And his work.
Absolutely. And Dallas was a dear friend of the Vineyard. He was very close to people like Todd
his
Hunter.
book, Divine Conspiracy.
absolutely.
It's such. I mean, it's about
Revolutionary.
that Sermon on the Mount, but it's such a kingdom book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It could be a Vineyard text for all it mattered. I mean, it kind of is.
And honestly, people like Don Williams, if you're familiar with
Yes,
that
of
name,
course.
sort of one of our great sort of minds and hearts that really helped give articulation to sort of a Vineyard perspective on theology. I mean, for Don, that was a massive text. And I mean, he was handing Divine Conspiracy out through the Vineyard like candy when it first came out. It's like, everybody's got to read this. Everybody's got to read this.
Yes, amazing.
So absolutely true.
So your spiritual journey was like from hardcore cessationist to some sort of like really a textual awakening during college, that maybe something else was there. Then you begin to experience it in Anaheim, and then there's notes of the message of the kingdom, which also include things like the Sermon on the Mount that set your life in a new way.
I would say so.
And then what happened? Like you're still at the Baptist church? You're like flying back and forth to
No,
Vineyard
not
meetings?
flying back and forth. Actually, well,
Yeah.
actually, we were forbidden to. We actually had to sign a document with our denomination
Yeah.
that we would not attend anything Vineyard until we'd settled this issue theologically within our denomination. Because our little church was growing rapidly. It wasn't breaking huge records per se, but we were at that time, the fastest growing Fellowship Baptist Church in Canada. We'd grown to around 300 people in our first, within the window of our first year. Almost all conversion growth, like 70 to 80%. We were baptizing people in the lake that's in the middle of our city, the Okanagan Lake. Like we couldn't even keep up. Our dear friends Wes and Stacy Campbell, who were we were cohorts in all this whole thing we planted together. Wes was an extraordinary evangelist, like for real. So there was this, but in the midst of this was this hungering for worship, really, and the expression of it. Yeah, so we were still Baptist. I just throw another little thread in here, which is kind of interesting. about 10 months after sort of this experience in Anaheim, our whole community went through just an absolute baptism in the Spirit. Probably this like the best.
Was
way
it
to say
because you were preaching on these things, or what?
No,
What
in
happened?
fact,
was it just in worship? Like, what happened?
Worship was a very, very significant piece of it. But what happened, actually, we were going to do a Christmas party in December of 87 with our elders team. It was one of the rare times when everybody was there, husbands, wives, kids, like this whole thing. Well, maybe not kids, few babysitters, but like this mix. And one of our guys said, well, let's just pray. We're going to like jump in the hot tub and shoot some pool and whatever. Just kind of did a little prayer. Although we'd been the Spirit had been brooding. And ever since I'd come back from Anaheim, I was praying for people who are like flying across my living room and like, all kinds of crazy stuff. But it really hadn't been a corporate thing. And not even all our leaders were in that. But we went to pray, and all of a sudden, it's like the Spirit just fell in the room.
Mm.
We had one of our big boys, one of our big elders, sitting on a love seat, and he didn't go up and down. He literally, I looked at him, and he physically just went right down and completely broke the frame of the furniture he was sitting in and just crashed down onto the floor. And we just started wailing and crying. There was prophecy. It was like, we had nowhere to stick this.
Yeah. So what happened to you as a pastor in that moment? Like,
yeah, we were all discombobulated.
Amazing.
Yeah, all really discombobulated. Slowly brought it out kind of to the church. And that was another then real reach to Vineyard people, because there was something about the posture, the lack of hype. Like there was just something really trusting in it, I guess is like the word to say.
Yeah.
So we were reaching to George Malone on the coast, Ken Blue. These are just some of some old names.
And so did your church become a Vineyard, or did they ask you to leave?
Eventually. Yeah, we called it eventually. We did get the left foot of fellowship. But we hung as long as we could. We signed these agreements that we wouldn't go to Vineyard things.
It's interesting to me that you signed the agreement, we won't go to the Vineyard thing, and then all of a sudden the Vineyard thing starts happening.
Yeah, it was just blowing up. Like it was uncontainable. Like Amazing. For real. Yeah, absolutely. And then obviously, worship just extraordinary.
And were you leading worship at this time?
Yeah, I was. We were co-pastoring. It was kind of this thing coming out of sort of the tradition we were in. I was very musical, obviously, all the classical training, everything. But I never saw music as part of, if you were called to the gospel and you were called to the church, that I didn't want to lead Easter cantatas for the rest of my life. Like I just dove into preaching, into that kind of proclamation, and then it was this amazing experience. And Wimber was so helpful in this stuff. Who's got more authority in the community, the preacher or the worship leader? Wimber's answer was always, well, it depends who's got the mic at any given time.
Yeah.
Like we carry these things in tandem and walk them together. And so this whole creative side and musical side and writing side of who I was just burgeoned, just like came alive.
Is this when you started writing songs?
I had started writing a little bit in college outside of the classical box, but it wasn't what I would even call worship. I mean, it was very heartfelt.
Yeah.
Worship began there, and one of the first songs that came out of that time was "You're Worthy of My Praise."
Yeah.
Yeah, it was just this.
How old were you?
I would have been 23, 24.
Yeah.
Somewhere in there. No, 20. Yeah, right around there, 24.
And so that was maybe the first song that you would call worship. That you
one of them. I'd written another a song called Adoration. And again, it was a time of history where you're reaching for material. You're kind of pumped everything dry around you, and the Vineyard stuff was sort of resonated with us. There were other expressions that were definitely out there and beautiful and wonderful, but there was just something that was more true to the kind of musical language and heart language that we were trying to give expression to. But even with that, you're running out of,
Yeah, there's no worship industry.
Not then.
No,
not like it exists now.
Yeah,
no.
You wouldn't have even thought to be a part of that.
No.
Yeah.
No. And then you're predating, internet, all that stuff.
Yeah.
You're kind of just reaching from an other place, different place of desperation at some level. But then in the midst of that, I'm at the back of the church one day. One of the one of the young guys. I could never tell anyone how old I was because, you had to pretend you were older. So one of the young guys was probably the same age that I was, but, I'm training up, mentoring. A guy named Malcolm was up leading worship, doing a beautiful job. I was leaning against the back of the church. And this would have been right at the end of 87 in this same year window. So a long time ago. Some of you listening to this weren't even born.
That's right.
But, I'm leaning against this back wall and I heard as clear as a bell. I didn't understand it, but I heard it. The fragrance of worship is justice. And where there's no justice, there's no fragrance. And it was like I got punched like right in the gut.
Did you have any idea in the moment what that meant?
No, I just crumpled down. And I was weeping, but I was like, what does that even mean? So being a good Baptist boy, I just started drilling into the text and it was like, oh my word, this is everywhere.
Yeah.
Most particularly the Amos 5 fragrance text, and then away with the noise of your songs.
Yes.
Which was like this very disorienting, very, very disorienting. I woke up the next morning and had a series of almost like a rolling slideshow of the poor, multi-generational, multiracial, different. It was weird. I couldn't stop it. It was just like a rolling thing. I was in the shower, actually. I was in this rolling thing and I just crumpled down and I came out of the shower. It's the funniest thing I don't know if I've ever told this story outside of, a few little contexts or friends, but yeah, I started driving around our city and I was just weak. Like I was just like, what's going on? So the beauty of this encounter with the Spirit, like it was a live environment. And yet this thing even with that, there was something missing, at least for me. And I pulled into one of the largest Pentecostal churches in the city at that time, was good friends with the pastor. And I just burst into his office and I just said, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. We haven't cared for the poor. And he's like, he doesn't know what's going on.
Yeah.
And he's grabbing Kleenex boxes and everything. And I just was in there for, I don't know, an hour or so. And he kindly just sat there.
Did he have any idea what to make of it?
He didn't know what was going on. I mean, he could feel something, we would talk about it later, obviously. I just had to discharge this thing, right? And then I went to a close friend in the community and just kind of crashed. And that was the seeds of, to this
really
day.
Your life story.
Like, oh yeah.
I mean, just as an outside observer,
it pushed me
when I think of you, I think
deep.
of like the idea of it's not just worship music,
right?
Or songwriting.
Yeah. That was, I think, that was gifted to me by the Lord, like very, very beginnings of everything.
Yeah. And then how did that express itself? Because I mean, I know that has been a big part of your journey, but when did the marriage of worship and justice begin to really?
I'd say initially it was more worship and mercy. Through study, reflection, experience, you begin to move deeper into the actual turning yourself towards challenging systemic issues as well as trying to bring change there, if that makes sense. But the initial right away, I'd driven by a set of motels on my way to our church office every day, for however many years, or a couple years, like just going by it. It was always there. I never saw it. I saw it, but I didn't see it, if that makes sense. And all of a sudden I saw it, like just within the couple days. And I was like, oh my goodness, I think there's maybe people in there that are marginalized and disenfranchised. And so long story short, I just pulled over the car and I started just kind of walking around and saw this old lady named Betty. And I just started asking her a story. And quite a few years earlier, her husband had walked out one day to go get the mail and never came back. And she just started this downslide of poverty and was barely holding it together, living in this motel in the middle of beautiful, I mean, freaking beautiful Kelowna, British Columbia. And a lot of wealth, a lot of whatever. I'm not pitting one thing against the other, but just this veneer of whatever. but would never, if you had come to me and said, oh, Jesus wants you to care for the poor and all that, I go, well, I get that, but, we actually don't really have that here. So
Yeah.
maybe it's not something we can really explore or understand. And there she was, not it. There she was.
Yes.
But I knew in that moment, this couldn't be about calling the church, trying to start a program, whatever. Like, we weren't even thinking about this stuff. So I just went home to Anita, my wife. We had 2 little daughters at that time, and we just thought, well, what can we do? It's just kind of, who do you see and what do you have? So we just started pulling stuff out of our own cupboard and grabbing a few blankets off the spare bed, and started this beautiful relationship with Betty, which a few years down the road led to her own personal awareness of Jesus and stuff, which was kind of cool. But that wasn't even necessarily even what it was about even initially. So that was kind of like the little embryonic start, and then it just starts rippling. It starts rippling, and I think in a very healthy way, just different friends just kind of coming in the wake of that, and then eventually found some sort of infrastructural and programmatic kind of gears that could give people on-ramps and that sort of a thing. But we've always tried from that very, very first moment to make it more about us, and knowing that we'd never graduate from that. It's not, well, I can put my time in with the poor for 4 or 5 years and then move on to other aspects of leadership or the gospel or church planting or mission or whatever. Like, that for us is always right at the heart. And then especially as worshipers and people that care about worship. And then as we did eventually become actually part of the vineyard, understanding, wow, if this is really deep in our wheelhouse and part of what we carry, it has to be anchored here, or it's just songs again.
So you go from like cessationist, good Southern Baptist boy.
Not Southern Baptist, brother. We were Canadian Baptist.
Canadian Baptist, yes, of course. That's how entrenched it is in my own brain.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Canadian Baptist boy. But then you become aware of the Spirit. The Spirit begins to work in your church.
Yes.
But then shortly thereafter, the Spirit begins to say, I want you to see these people.
Very much, yeah. And actually, part of even that initial sort of wave of the Spirit hitting us as a community, as we look back, like embedded even in a lot of the prophetic wooing and sort of, there was so much about children, the poor, those that you don't normally see, but you're just kind of in the euphoria of the encounter. You miss some of those threads. So yeah, but you're right. Like, it was in the mix of us. Yeah.
Well, I guess my question now at this point is like, okay, so you've made this journey, and I know you're a songwriter. How did that change your songwriting, or how did that change your worship, like your corporate gathering?
Yeah, good question. Yeah,
it's a bit of a leading question.
No,
I would assume it changed what you put on paper.
It did, for sure. Yeah. You start writing with an awareness of the other. So not just giving voice to the community that's gathered right there, but also giving voice to the community that's yet to find itself, or that is scattered, and then a real gift. We had a short stint, 91 to 94, where we were part of the Kansas City kind of swirl. Metro. It was a vineyard at that time. It was very significant for us, beautiful. But I think the main way that it began to find expression, especially as we moved there and stuff, was to carry this into the space of intercession. And so that was kind of another aspect of worship for me that had this. There was an attraction to sort of the prophetic kind of wild edge of the creative experience as well as sort of worship. But this kind of gave it for me at least, like an anchor spot. And it was like, oh, this could really be unto something.
Yeah.
And calling out to the throne, but also this sort of the power of sound, of lyric, of melody, however the Spirit breathes into that actually becomes a part of the trumpet for justice. Yes. But also the movement of it. Like Walter Wink, I'm not sure if his stuff, the South Africa, he's like history is in the hands of the intercessors.
Yes.
And I think that's really true. But again, in that very grounded, dirt under your fingernails kind of way. But you can't touch, in my opinion, that the depth of that kind of intercession without being with people and incarnated into some of those spaces.
Yeah, I think that's really important, isn't it? It's not just to pray, but be willing to let God use you as an answer at certain
Exactly.
point, you know?
Yeah.
Not to be too grandiose, but you know what I'm trying to get at. It's like we
yeah. But
God,
then again, it informs the song, and it
informs the prayer or the lyric. Yes,
and you begin to call out from a place of solidarity versus from a place of sort of distance.
Oh, yeah.
To me, that's the beauty of the history of American musicology is the black spirituals, the sort of this. I mean, you have the same thing coming out of the hovels of Soweto, or some of the deep sounds that come out of some of the Asian hills, where there's a lot of oppression. You find this rhythm resonant sound that is this deep cry that is full of hope and longing, and yet saturated in lament, So I don't know if that even makes sense what I'm saying, but it's this.
Yeah.
There's something there that actually begins then to become, it begins to shape culture. So if you look at rock and roll, even blues, measure of bluegrass, all that, the root system is the black spiritual.
Yes.
Like it spawned all of that sort of expression and creativity
and from the place of injustice.
Absolutely.
It's a corporate sound again, isn't it?
There you go. I fully agree.
Yeah. And then it just keeps permeating wider and wider into culture in new forms.
I think so.
Yeah. While you were talking there, it also is interesting to me that because you were talking about like worship and justice. We've been talking about that for a moment. That even in maybe the more secular arena of justice work, there's oftentimes like a protest song. Like they go together, don't they?
They really do.
I mean, we're talking about a kingdom context, but those resonances go further out than we think.
Exactly.
I mean, those songs are deep in even our own country's history.
And that could be evidence, actually, just riffing off this, like, could that be, let's ask the question, could that be evidence of, that's where the kingdom's breaking in?
Yes.
Like, it's actually evidence of the kingdom at work.
Yeah.
And so how do we see what the Father is doing in the midst of that sound and in the midst of that space and come alongside it or cultivate it or welcome it into the larger vocabulary and expression even of the church.
The little breadcrumbs that show the way a little bit.
Absolutely.
That's amazing. Okay, so you were in Canada, you came into the vineyard, and then you were in Kansas City. All of this stuff is just alive in you. Yeah. And then I know that you went back to Canada, right?
Yeah.
To Winnipeg?
Yeah.
And I know that you guys did major justice work there.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you just tell us, what was that about? Or what was that like? I know that last night over dinner, you were talking to us about like, you were really reaching out to the native culture and the, just the drug culture that was so present and the
glue sniffing,
culture. Like, what was that your target? Was that just who was there? How did that?
Great question.
How did that work? And how did you gather those?
Great question.
Those people.
Yeah, I think we'd been enough in our journey distilled. Now it's really interesting to get this too, because we moved to Winnipeg, the heart of the city, in '95. So, like, for real, the intensity and vibrancy of the Toronto blessing, renewal, all that. I hope if people don't have a reference for that. I mean, it was just another intense sort of moment in vineyard history where there was just, that's when we went there. So it was kind of this interesting combo of, I knew sort of our life's calling was kind of in a next season, a next step. And the question was, do we step into the kind of the opportunities that were in front of us of more of a itinerant / platform kind of ministry? And I don't even mean that in a negative way.
Yeah,
but
that was available.
Those doors were opening so wide. And Wimber sat me down in the midst of some of this, and I'll never forget, he said, just this passing thing. And yet in its passing, it just really became part of my discernment process. He said, David, you need to understand opportunity doesn't always equal the will of God. And he said, I can see in front of you, there's going to be lots of opportunity, and you've really got to get on. I mean, these are my application, get on your face, just listen, you and Anita really be in sync, really be. So it was a crazy time. So sort of in this sense of calling for it, I was so grateful that, 7 years earlier, or however long it was, that the Lord had so deposited this fusion, and for me now it had fully gelled into a theological conviction. Yeah. This fusion of worship and justice, which again is a whole long conversation, what we actually mean by that. But that I knew any step forward, I couldn't have those things not in operation together. There was this sense of a calling to church plant again. And we just thought, if we're going to do that, we have to from the ground floor kind of get this right.
Yeah.
Anyway, long story, it was very clear, the city, all of this stuff, going back onto Canadian soil, which is where obviously we were originally from.
It's just interesting to me that John would give you such a word of wisdom like that.
Oh my gosh.
Because he could have leveraged you.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
that's true.
I don't mean to be so market oriented, but you know what I mean? It would have been good to have David Ruis.
Sure.
Go wider.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
But he comes with this word of wisdom.
Yeah. And I think actually, I'm just thinking about this now. I don't know if I've ever even thought of it this way. We turned away from, and again, doesn't make this right and anything else wrong. It's not about this, but in our journey, kind of following our nose to the guts of an urban center, very impoverished, with glue sniffers. And I'll get back to answering your way earlier question on where they are target, were they just there, that sort of thing. Going down into there, it was out of that environment. I don't know if people have a frame of reference for this, but the album Sweet Mercies was written there. And Vineyard was kind of we normally don't do this. And there's all sorts of some myths and, whatever on all this history. But yeah, normally don't do a solo project kind of a thing. But it felt like this stuff was coming out of this deep soil, that even though I wasn't traveling that much then, and it wasn't even in our psyche as a Vineyard movement, that it needed to get, we're back to our roots of that needs to get documented. That needs to get captured. So if you're familiar with that album at all, there are a few kind of out of the box things in it, especially for
the time.
Whenever it was,
Yeah, it was on the edge.
Oh yeah. Starts with a very non-corporate sort of unpacking of the Psalms, just kind of a half read, half sung, sort of thing. And then some really great corporate tunes in the mix of it. But yeah, it was a little kind of out of its sort of moment. That seems to be the way I am.
But anyway, the canvas that came on was Winnipeg.
Was the streets of Winnipeg amongst glue sniffers, this whole thing. So that step was a further pursuit of my calling in worship, to tell you the truth. Now, always blended with church planting, other aspects of serving community through different aspects of leadership, but worship always really central in that. And so we knew we were to go into the heart of the city, knew we were supposed to go into the heart of the country. There's layers and layers to that story, but so stepping in there, and I think I can say with a real purity and a clear conscience, we just went where we felt the Lord wanted us to be, and we just found out who was there.
Yeah, and this community was just they were there.
So here's maybe a fun story. So there was we made some friends. We didn't know anybody in Winnipeg at all. There were no vineyards in that part of Canada at that time. We kind of pioneered vineyards into the center space of Canada. There were vineyards in the east, vineyards in the west, and really nothing in the middle, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. That whole space was just a vineyard-free zone sort of a thing, which was interesting that we went in and started there in an urban environment in probably the most rural part of the country. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But went down into this context, and long story short, I'm introduced to a gal named Susan Chief, and not a follower of Jesus, single mom, barely hanging it together, did have a really beat up little broken house right in the heart of our city, which then, of course, became the safe haven for dozens and dozens of relatives, friends, everybody that were bouncing up and down from street level, blitzed out of their minds on glue and various things, children just bouncing all over the place. But I met Susan. I said, "Hey, Susan, like this is for real. Like, hey, Susan, I need friends. Like, I'm new to town. Like, what if, I'm not going to bring alcohol because I know that's like a major trigger, like for everybody. And I just can't facilitate that. Although I enjoy a beer every once in a while and stuff, but yeah, I can bring some soda. I can grab some chips and stuff. Like if you provide the place, what if you just like you help me like throw a little party so I can meet some people in Winnipeg? She's like for real, Aboriginal gal, it's like, yeah, I'm like, so first one I go into, there's probably 30 plus people and exactly what I described, bouncing off the walls, kids everywhere, whole 9 yards. And we just start generating these sort of connection points just to meet people.
Yeah.
And we're still in the sort of formative kind of stages of the church plan, if you will. But for us, this was as much the church as anything. In fact, it is the church, right?
Yes.
So anyway, long story short, I'm sorry, you're triggering all these memories, man.
Yeah, no, this is a huge story.
So it's like really cool. So one day I'm sitting with them and I just get this thought, and I realized later, I think it really was the Holy Spirit. But I said, "Do you guys pray?" And the whole place is just like, "What do you mean? Do we pray?" Like they actually got kind of upset.
Yes.
They were like, "I can't like pay the bills. I got 4 kids from 4 different
That's
men.
all we do is pray."
Exactly. We go to bed every night like weeping in prayer. We don't know where it's going or what it's doing, but are you kidding me? And I had this little thought. I said, "Hey, let me tell you a story." I said, way back in the early days of all this stuff. So if you guys can get your heads here,
yeah,
pre-white man's religion, pre any of the crazy crap that you all went through.
So these are mostly
100% First Nations.
Okay.
100%.
Oh, amazing.
So totally,
you're the white guy there.
I'm the white guy.
Yeah. Amazing.
And I said, so if you can get your head predate all that stuff and actually the birthing of what we would understand, what gets shaped in community, in faith, and everything as we follow Jesus actually is not white, blah, blah,
Yeah.
But it's like, so if you can get your head there, let me tell you this story. So there was a guy crying out to God, and, it's the story of Cornelius and Peter. And I kind of play it out, right? And I go, oh my goodness, you guys, I think I could be the guy in the story that showed up because you were praying, this Cornelius, this God-fearer, it says in the text. F.F. Bruce, makes it very clear.
Yes.
He's not Jewish. He's not like, but he's calling out.
Yes.
The cool thing in the story, he's also giving alms to the poor.
Yes.
But so I said, what if
worship and justice again?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I'm like, what if my family moved here because you guys were praying?
Yeah, you brought me here.
They're like, what? We did this? I'm like,
maybe.
I think it could be. What if we went to figure this out together? Anyway, it was this like amazing moment. Boom.
Yeah, lights are on.
So much exploded. So the fun part of this, within the next couple times, I got this idea. What would it sound like? There's imagery around Jesus and in the biblical like stories of rivers and all that. A river was very significant to Winnipeg. The Red River like flows right through the heart of the city, and we're very close to the Red River at this time. And anyway, all kinds of stuff there. I said, "What?" So she's Cree, mano sapi tapamibide, like let the river flow. I'm like, oh, that's so cool.
Yeah. So
we just start kind of riffing on this thing with this. I mean, half the room is bombed on sniff. A whole bunch of others.
Is this at church now?
No. This is back in this house.
This is at the party.
We haven't. Huh?
This is at the party.
Yeah, one of the parties. Like this is like, 4 or 5 down the road. And we haven't, I don't even think we'd launched public services yet. And let the river flow. So I don't know if you know that. So,
of course.
So it's like, so the cool thing was this. Susan Chief is a co-writer on that.
No way.
50%. And renewal has just hit. That song goes on to Sweet Mercies. And, you know, I mean, it was insane. I mean, there was some significant revenue coming in. So it's like so fun to watch, you know, this is an image. Like I didn't like lurk around her house, but like to know she was going to the mailbox
Yes.
every quarter,
Yes.
pulling this check out. She's not even a quote unquote follower of Jesus yet. She's not bad, you know, and she's getting remuneration from Vineyard Worship.
Amazing.
I know, it's like so fun, and that put food on her table, on so many other people's table. Like
I've never
that
heard,
was
I've
so
never heard
rewarding.
This story
I know.
before. It's
There's all kinds of
amazing.
crazy stories like this, but yeah, isn't that like amazing? And so it was so deeply embedded.
So
in who we were in our story.
Your songwriting is deeply connected to those people, to those stories, to that moment.
Every move I make, we were in Johannesburg. And I'd met a guy named Trevor. He's still in the Vineyard movement, and we're doing the conference, you know, over here, you know, this big Wimber thing. And I just thought, I gotta taste something. I gotta taste, you know. So Trevor takes me into Soweto, like behind the thing. I mean, that was life changing. I mean, just revolutionary. Just going down into that community, and then we're over in Johannesburg. We're in this little beat up gymnasium, and I'd just gone to a Johnny Clegg concert, so I'm just like freaking, you know, Savuka and, you know, all that stuff. So it's like, really, I'm just pumped, you know. So we're in this thing, and there's Zulu dancers like with sticks, like the whole thing.
Yeah.
And I'm watching this, and I can just hear this thing in my head. No, 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 no. It's never been recorded the way that I actually experienced it and what it was birthed out of.
And for those of you who are not in the room right now, David is doing the motions. He's doing the motions.
Yeah, exactly.
To this dance.
Yeah, exactly. So you might be familiar with the song, like Every Move I Make. So like it's so fun to have some of these things that have found some wings, like in the larger church. And it's not the most sophisticated song. It's not the whatever, but it certainly captured the imagination of a lot of people. And then very rewarding, you know, really got into the vocabulary of children's worship, like in kind of a very cool way, I think. But yeah, it was birthed in a gymnasium in Johannesburg with Zulus, like just again, this cry. But again, you can have this justice cry and almost a measure of lament that has this. So that was the thing, right? Waves of mercy, waves of grace, like not just in the meeting or in the renewal or in this context, but like, let the waves just crash. Everywhere I look, I see your face. I mean, I'm in the heart of Soweto.
Yeah.
They don't even have running water, no electricity. And I'm seeing Jesus more there than anywhere else.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, wow.
That's the real message of the kingdom, isn't it?
I agree.
It's the God is always at work.
Yeah.
In every place, with every people.
Yeah.
No matter the situation. Yeah. That really confronts our charismatic ideas of God's activity, doesn't it?
For real.
Yeah. Yeah. It's easy for us to think as charismatics that he's only at work in the healing.
Right.
Or the breakthrough.
Right.
Yeah. But there's this other side.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's amazing that it's just touched your music over and over.
I think so. I hope so.
No, I think it is. I mean, these stories, David, I've known you for a while and I've never heard these stories. So that's really great. Dang. That's great. That's really great. Well, here's what I want to do, because we've kind of
we've gone all over the place.
We've sort of absorbed our time. I want to ask you two more questions, and obviously we're just sort of like cutting this story short, so we'll have to do this again.
Sure, I'd love to.
Yeah,
absolutely.
But I want to ask you two more questions before we jump out. The first question I want to ask you is, I mean, you're a worship person, you're a writer, you're a pastor, you're leading the national movement in Canada. What would you like to say to the worship leaders, not just in the vineyard, but just worship leaders? You know, this isn't meant to be propaganda.
No, I understand.
So just, you know, this is further than the vineyard.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, you've got some perspective. What do you want to say? I mean, you've already said a lot, but maybe there's something you'd like to say to this community that we're wanting to serve. Yeah,
that's a good question. I like to think about it a lot more than just shoot something off the top of my head. But what comes off the top of my head
great.
is reach for community, you know, and reach for the long play. So don't give up or don't get discouraged. Turn your face to the process of working things through with whether that's a cantankerous senior pastor or a community that doesn't fully understand your artistry or what you want to bring to your heart. So stay in a servant's heart without fully selling out, if you will. I know that's very loaded language, and people read all more probably into that than I mean, but you don't have to sell out to sort of become the cookie cutter person to be a success.
Yes.
But at the same time, don't pull away from the long suffering, that aspect of the fruit of the Spirit. There is a long suffering hanging in there, and making sure that you're reflecting and serving grassroots, and that needs to be processed in dialogue, though.
Yeah.
With whatever team setting you're in, or whatever staff, if you're volunteer or you're vocational or whatever, and make sure you're giving language to your community. And that could be one of the great CCLI sort of top shelf songs, could really be speaking to unlocking what the faith language of your church at that time. But where it's not, right.
That's right.
Speak.
Yes.
Call it out, cultivate it, pull people together to find out where that sound is, and all of that. And yeah, we never want to lose the organic sort of grassroots thing of our calling, is to give voice for the community. And so then know the journey. Yeah. Who's died in the church? Who's just got a new job? What are the high points? What are the low points? Where are we rejoicing with those who rejoice and weeping with those who weep, and give articulation to that on a weekly basis? What an incredible gift.
That's really the difference between just being a worship leader and being a worship pastor.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what I hear in what you're saying
exactly.
right now. I hear you saying, do the long thing to become a worship pastor.
I believe so. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, and we're not song leaders. We're liturgists more than anything.
What does that mean to you?
That means to me that you're curating or shaping in experience. And I don't mean in a hype or manipulative sense, but that people can enter into and actually find transformation, hope, and healing in the midst of it. So not just a quick fix because I had a rough week, but an actual space that invites people into the deep place of transformation and an actual encounter with the living Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
So for a lot of our vineyards, and I know it's not right across the board, but I'd really appeal, to whatever aspects of leadership we have, really have the table at our center, the Lord's table, the host, Jesus as the host and Jesus as the meal. I think one of our worship leaders in Canada, who I just deeply respect and is pretty significant in our national scene, has said, the state for us in the vineyard, because of our values, the platform is a helpful tool, but it's a lousy center.
Yes.
The center needs to be the table.
Yeah, and in Protestant churches or charismatic churches, in a Protestant church, maybe the center of the meeting is a sermon.
Yes.
In a charismatic church, maybe the center of the meeting is ministry or a prophetic word.
Yeah.
But in a historic sense, the center of the meeting has always been Eucharist, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think there's something there for us to learn.
Yeah.
I mean, oversimplified and way, easily stated, but, one of the key sort of shifts in Protestant culture was putting the table out of the center and pulling the pulpit from the side and to the middle. So if you go even into mainline churches now, the pulpit's always over at the side, and I remember going into church, I go, what's wrong with these people?
It's the parable of their architecture.
Very, very much.
Yeah.
Your space and your architecture speaks as much to your theology as anything else, for sure.
That's great. Well, I want to ask you one more question before we wrap up here, and then we'll be done. Oh, this is great.
All right.
This is the final question.
I feel like I'm just shooting
this is
all
great.
over the place.
This is wonderful.
I'm kind of tired too, so I could be a little loopy.
You and I are both tired. Oh man, we're whipped after this week. No, this is the last question. David, tell me a time when you experienced overwhelming joy. This is a totally different kind of question. It doesn't even have to be like the most joy you ever experienced, but just like was there a season or a moment when you just experienced like,
Yeah, the first thought that comes to my head.
yeah, that's exactly what I want.
Not dissing my 3 girls at all, and it
Yes.
wasn't even about the gender of this child. But when my son was born,
Yeah.
it was our fourth child.
Yeah.
We were living in Kansas City, and yeah, there was just something.
Yeah.
I remember
In that season or in the moment?
in that moment, and I think it's maybe connected to a season. I don't know. That's a very interesting question because, yeah, I would remember it as a moment, but it was definitely in the center of a season where, yeah, the Lord was speaking to me in very, very deep, profound ways. But yeah, just the birth of this kid, I remember just running up and down the hospital hallway. I must have looked like a bit of a nut job, but
Yeah. I love that.
yeah, yelling. Actually, I don't know if you're gonna have to cut this up. I was like, "He's got the biggest you've ever seen." Like
That's
I'm just
it.
like
Come
I was just like running up, like it was like this weird. And again, it wasn't about the son thing. It
yeah.
had nothing, and it wasn't like, oh, I've got my air. Like honestly, a daughter, I would have been just as. But I don't know. There was something in that moment, just of this.
Yeah, it just captured you.
Celebration of life, of maybe something different. Like it was just this. Anyway.
Yeah, that's great.
So I don't know if that's the answer. That's what popped straight into my head was.
Well, that's the question I'm going to be asking everyone on this podcast
that's
at
great.
the end.
Pretty cool.
And what's interesting is as I've talked to people, there's so much harmony in moments of joy. Like the kinds of things that come back, they tend to be very similar.
Yeah, interesting.
Birth of children is almost always there.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
For real?
Yeah.
Oh, that's kind of fascinating. That's
Yeah,
great.
I've just been asking people this question for a few years now, and it oftentimes comes back to that.
Isn't that funny?
Yeah. There's something there that we just need to go into maybe. Awesome.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah.
David, thanks for doing this with us. Listen, and I know that we're gonna cross paths again. We have to pick this story up because we didn't talk about Hollywood. We didn't talk about going back to Canada or any of the theological stuff that I want to get into with you. So
sure,
we're gonna do that. All right.
Great.
High fives.
Okay.
Hey everybody, this is Casey Corum, the producer of the Ferment Podcast. Thanks for listening. I got a couple quick things for you. If you haven't already subscribed, please do so. We've got a bunch of exciting shows coming up and we don't want you to miss a thing. So on social media, you can find us on Instagram at the Ferment Podcast, and on Twitter, you can find us at FermentCast. Please let us know what you think of the podcast by leaving a review on iTunes. All right, see you next time. Peace.